The morning fog rolled in from the Pacific like a living thing, swallowing the jagged cliffs of Devil's Slide whole. Officer James Roge RS had driven this stretch of Highway 1 hundreds of times, but on March 15, 1977, something felt different. The way the mist clung to his windshield, the way his radio crackled with an unusual static, the way his coffee tasted bitter in his mouth, even though he'd made it the same way for the past 8 years. Rogers was a creature of habit. Every morning at 6:30 a.m. sharp, he'd pull out of the San Mateo County Sheriff's Department parking lot in his patrol unit, number 247. His route was always the same: Highway 1 south to Devil's Slide, then north to Pacifica, then back again. 3 times each shift. The other deputies called it the Death Watch, not because of what happened to the drivers who lost control on those curves, though that happened plenty, but because of what the isolation did to a man's mind. Devil's Slide had earned its name honestly. The narrow 2-lane highway carved into the cliff face had claimed more lives than anyone cared to count. Cars would slide off the edge during winter storms, plummeting 200 feet into the churning ocean below. Sometimes they'd find the wreckage washed up on the rocks weeks later. Sometimes they never found anything at all. The locals whispered that the devil himself lived in those waters, collecting souls like coins. But Rogers wasn't superstitious. He was methodical, reliable, the kind of cop who wrote detailed reports and never missed a shift. His wife Martha would pack his lunch every morning at 6:15, 2 sandwiches and an apple. Always an apple. She'd kiss him goodbye at the kitchen door and tell him to be careful on those cliffs. He'd promise he would, and for 8 years he'd kept that promise. The morning of March 15th started like any other. Rogers' alarm went off at 5:45. He showered, shaved, and put on his pressed uniform. Martha made coffee while he checked his gear. Service weapon, check. Radio, check. Flashlight, check. The same routine that had become as natural as breathing. At 6:28, he backed out of the driveway of their modest home on Pine Street. Martha waved from the window, just like always, but as Rogers drove toward Devil's Slide that morning, the fog seemed thicker than usual, more oppressive. It pressed against the windows of his patrol car like fingers, searching for a way inside. The radio chattered with routine calls, a fender bender in Daly City, a noise complaint in Pacifica. Nothing unusual, nothing that would explain what was about to happen. At 7:15 a.m., Rogers called in his location to dispatch. He was beginning his first pass through Devil's Slide, southbound. His voice was clear and professional over the radio, no hint of distress, no indication that anything was wrong. The dispatcher, Jenny Martinez, had worked with Rogers for 3 years. Later, she would tell investigators that he sounded exactly like he always did. Calm, focused, present. That was the last time anyone heard from Officer James Rogers. When he failed to check in at 8 a.m., dispatch tried to raise him on the radio. Static. They tried again at 8:15. Nothing. By 8:30, Sergeant Bill Hammond was driving Code 3 toward Devil's Slide, his emergency lights cutting through the morning gloom. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his career. Rogers' patrol car sat empty on the shoulder of Highway 1, just north of the most treacherous curve. The engine was still running. The driver's door was open. His coffee cup sat in the center console, still warm to the touch. His radio was functioning perfectly, but Officer James Rogers was gone. Hammond called for backup immediately. Within an hour, Devil's Slide was crawling with law enforcement. Sheriff's deputies, highway patrol, search and rescue teams. They combed every inch of the highway and the cliffs below. They brought in helicopters to search the water. Divers went down as far as the brutal currents would allow. They found nothing. Rogers' service weapon was still in its holster, secured in the patrol car. His wallet was in his back pocket, exactly where it should be. His wedding ring was still on his finger. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no footprints leading away from the scene. It was as if he had simply vanished into the fog. The initial investigation was thorough and professional. Detective Ray Sullivan led the case, and he was known for his attention to detail. He interviewed Martha Rogers extensively. She told him about their quiet breakfast that morning, about how normal everything had seemed. Rogers had been in good spirits, no financial problems, no marital issues, no enemies that she knew of, just a dedicated cop doing his job. Sullivan looked into Rogers' recent cases. Had he arrested someone who might want revenge? Had he stumbled onto something that made him a target? The files revealed nothing unusual. Routine traffic stops, a few domestic disturbances. A burglary investigation that had gone nowhere. Nothing that would explain his disappearance. The detective interviewed Rogers' fellow officers. They all said the same thing. Good cop. Reliable. Professional. A little quiet, maybe, but solid. If Rogers had been involved in something sketchy, none of them knew about it. And corruption wasn't his style. He was the kind of guy who'd write his own mother a ticket if she was speeding. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The search teams expanded their efforts. They checked every cave and crevice along the coast. They questioned everyone who lived or worked in the area. Gas station attendants, fishermen, hikers, surfers. No one had seen anything unusual that morning. No one had seen Rogers after 7:15 a.m. The media picked up the story, and for a while it was front-page news. Officer vanishes on Devil's Slide. Police baffled by disappearance. The headlines screamed from newspaper stands across the Bay Area. Tips poured in from the public. Rogers had been spotted in Oregon, in Mexico, in Las Vegas. Every lead was followed up. Every sighting was investigated. None of them panned out. Martha Rogers appeared on television pleading for information. She was composed but clearly devastated. Her husband was a good man, she said, a devoted officer. Someone must have seen something. Someone must know what happened. The camera caught the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she spoke. She aged years in those first few weeks. As time passed without answers, theories began to emerge. Some suggested that Rogers had staged his own disappearance. Maybe he was running from something. Maybe he had debts no one knew about. Maybe he had another life, another identity. But those who knew him rejected this idea immediately. Rogers wasn't the type. He was too straightforward, too honest, too devoted to Martha. Others thought he might have been the victim of a random crime. Maybe someone had forced him into their car at gunpoint. Maybe he'd been kidnapped, but there was no ransom demand, no evidence of foul play, no witnesses. It didn't make sense. The most popular theory, at least among the locals, was that Rogers had somehow fallen from the cliff. Maybe he'd gotten out of his car to investigate something and lost his footing in the fog. Maybe he'd been trying to help someone and slipped. The currents in that area were notorious for carrying bodies out to sea. It would explain why they never found remains. But Detective Sullivan wasn't satisfied with theories. He needed evidence. And the evidence, or lack thereof, didn't support any of the explanations. Rogers was an experienced officer. He knew those cliffs were dangerous. He wouldn't have gotten close to the edge without good reason. And even if he had fallen, they should have found some trace of him. The investigation continued for over a year. New detectives were brought in to provide fresh perspectives. Cold case specialists reviewed the file. The FBI was consulted. Nothing changed. Rogers had simply disappeared, leaving behind only questions and a grief-stricken wife who refused to give up hope. Eventually, the active investigation was scaled back. The case remained open, but resources were diverted to more current matters. Rogers' disappearance became just another cold case file gathering dust in the evidence room, just another unsolved mystery along the haunted stretch of highway known as Devil's Slide. Martha Rogers never remarried. She kept their house on Pine Street exactly as it was, as if she were waiting for him to come home from his shift. She continued to pack 2 sandwiches and an apple every morning out of habit, then throw them away when she realized what she'd done. The other wives in the neighborhood would see her sometimes, standing at the kitchen window at 6:28 a.m., watching the empty driveway. Years passed. New officers joined the force, old ones retired. The story of Officer James Rogers became legend, then faded into memory. Rookie cops would occasionally ask about it during quiet moments on patrol, and the veterans would tell them what little they knew. A good cop who vanished without a trace. A mystery that was never solved. A reminder that sometimes people just disappeared. The fog still rolled in from the Pacific every morning, still wrapped itself around the cliffs of Devil's Slide like it was searching for something. Drivers still lost control on those curves. The ocean still claimed its victims. And somewhere in the depths of those dark waters, the truth about what happened to Officer James Rogers waited patiently to be discovered. But 13 years would pass before anyone would find the first real clue. Miguel Santos had been fishing the waters off Devil's Slide since he was 12 years old. His father had taught him the rhythms of the Pacific, how to read the currents, and predict where the fish would be biting. 43 years later, Miguel knew these waters better than he knew his own reflection. He could tell you which rocks to avoid when the tide was coming in, which coves offered shelter during winter storms, and exactly where to drop his line to catch the biggest salmon. On the morning of September 8, 1990, Miguel was doing what he'd done thousands of times before. The sun was just beginning to peek over the coastal mountains, painting the fog-shrouded cliffs in shades of gold and amber. The waves were gentle, lapping against the rocky shoreline with a rhythm that had soothed fishermen for generations. Miguel had launched his small boat from the harbor in Half Moon Bay before dawn, as was his custom, and made his way north to his favorite spot. The tide had been unusually low that week, exposing sections of beach that were normally underwater. Miguel had noticed it the day before, how the shoreline seemed to stretch further into the ocean than he'd ever seen it. Old-timers called it a king tide, the kind that happened maybe once every few years. It revealed secrets that the sea usually kept hidden. Miguel anchored his boat in the shallow water and waded to shore with his metal detector. He'd taken up treasure hunting as a hobby after his retirement from the fish cannery, though he'd never found anything more valuable than a few coins and some old jewelry. Still, there was something peaceful about walking the beach in the early morning, listening to the methodical beeping of his detector, watching the sun burn away the coastal fog. He'd been searching for about an hour when the detector's tone changed. Instead of the usual steady beep that indicated trash or common metal, it emitted a sharp, insistent chirp. Miguel had heard that sound before. It meant something potentially interesting lay buried beneath the sand. He knelt down and began to dig with his small shovel, carefully scooping away the wet sand. About 6 inches down, his fingers touched something cold and metallic. He brushed away more sand, working slowly and methodically, the way his father had taught him to clean fish. Patience was everything. What emerged from the sand made Miguel's breath catch in his throat. It was a shell casing, brass-colored, but heavily corroded by years of saltwater exposure. But this wasn't from a hunting rifle or a common caliber that fishermen might use to scare off seals. The markings on the base, though faded, were still partially visible. This was from a police-issued firearm. Miguel had served 2 years in the army before coming home to work the cannery. He knew enough about ammunition to recognize police brass when he saw it. The size, the weight, the distinctive markings all pointed to law enforcement. But what was police ammunition doing buried in the sand at Devil's Slide, and how long had it been there? As he held the corroded casing up to the morning light, Miguel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. He'd lived in this area his entire life. He remembered the stories about the cop who'd vanished 13 years ago. Everyone did. It was the kind of mystery that became part of local folklore, passed down from fisherman to fisherman, from one generation to the next. Miguel carefully wrapped the shell casing in his handkerchief and made his way back to his boat. The fishing trip was forgotten now. All he could think about was getting to shore and calling the police. If this was connected to that missing officer, it was the first real evidence anyone had found in over a decade. The ride back to Half Moon Bay seemed to take forever. Every wave that rocked his boat felt like an obstacle, keeping him from what might be the most important discovery of his life. Miguel had always been a quiet man, not given to drama or excitement, but as he guided his boat through the harbor entrance, his hands were shaking. At the police station, Miguel was initially met with polite skepticism. The desk sergeant, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, listened to his story with the patient expression of someone who'd heard it all before. Fishermen were always finding things on the beach. Usually it was nothing more than debris washed up from old shipwrecks or trash tossed overboard by careless boaters. But when Miguel unwrapped the shell casing and placed it on the counter, the sergeant's expression changed. He'd been briefed on the Rogers case during his training, even though it was considered a cold file. Every cop in the county knew the story. And this was the first piece of physical evidence that had ever been found. The sergeant immediately called Detective Ray Sullivan, who was now the senior investigator for the county sheriff's department. Sullivan had never stopped thinking about the Rogers case, even after the active investigation was scaled back. He'd kept the file on his desk for years, occasionally pulling it out to review the witness statements and evidence photos. The case had become something of an obsession for him. When Sullivan arrived at the station and examined the shell casing, he felt the same chill that Miguel had experienced on the beach. The corrosion was extensive, but the basic characteristics were unmistakable. This was from a .38 caliber service revolver, the same type that Officer Rogers had carried on the day he disappeared. Sullivan immediately ordered the casing to be sent to the State Crime Lab for analysis. Modern forensic techniques had advanced considerably since 1977. If there were any fingerprints or other trace evidence on the brass, they might be able to recover it. More importantly, they could potentially match the firing pin impressions to Rogers's service weapon. While they waited for the lab results, Sullivan began the delicate process of reopening the investigation. The Rogers case had been officially cold for nearly a decade, but it had never been closed. Still, reactivating a major investigation required resources and manpower that the department couldn't spare without justification. The shell casing provided that justification. Sullivan's first call was to Martha Rogers. She was still living in the same house on Pine Street, still waiting for answers about her husband's fate. When he told her about the discovery, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, quietly, she asked if this meant they might finally learn what had happened to James. Sullivan couldn't make any promises. 13 years was a long time. Evidence degraded. Witnesses moved away or died. Memory became unreliable. But for the first time since that foggy morning in March 1977, they had something concrete to work with, something that might lead them toward the truth. The next challenge was assembling a team capable of handling such a complex cold case. Sullivan was a good detective, but he'd never worked anything this old or this complicated. The department needed someone with specialized experience in cold case investigations, someone who understood the unique challenges of working with degraded evidence and decades-old witness testimony. That's when Sullivan remembered hearing about Clara Moreno. She'd been a rookie deputy with the Sheriff's Department back in 1977, one of the first female officers in the county. She'd worked patrol for a few years before transferring to investigations, where she'd quickly earned a reputation for thoroughness and intuition. More importantly, she'd known James Rogers personally. They'd been patrol partners for several months before his disappearance. After leaving the Sheriff's Department in the mid-1980s, Moreno had started her own private investigation firm, specializing in cold cases. She'd developed techniques for working with old evidence and tracking down witnesses from decades-old crimes. Her success rate was impressive, and her reputation extended far beyond the local area. Sullivan had heard that Moreno was reluctant to take on cases involving former colleagues, but the Rogers disappearance was different. It had affected everyone in the department, but it had hit the female officers particularly hard. Rogers had been one of the few male cops who'd treated them as equals rather than curiosities. His disappearance had felt personal. When Sullivan called Moreno's office, her assistant said she was in court testifying in another cold case. She wouldn't be available until the following week. Sullivan left a detailed message, explaining about the shell casing and the renewed investigation. He emphasized how much the department needed her expertise, but he also knew that the decision would ultimately come down to Moreno's personal feelings about the case. 2 days later, Moreno called back. Her voice was older than Sullivan remembered, but it still carried the same quiet authority that had made her such an effective detective. She'd been thinking about the Rogers case for 13 years, she said. Not a week went by that she didn't wonder what had really happened on Devil's Slide that morning. She agreed to consult on the investigation, but with conditions. She wanted full access to all evidence and files. She wanted the authority to interview anyone connected to the case, regardless of their current position or status. And she wanted assurance that the department was committed to following the investigation wherever it led, even if the truth turned out to be uncomfortable. Sullivan agreed to her terms immediately. He knew that Moreno was probably their best chance of solving the case, maybe their only chance. The crime lab results came back 3 days before Moreno was scheduled to arrive. The shell casing had yielded more information than anyone had dared hope. Despite 13 years of exposure to salt water, technicians had been able to recover partial fingerprints from the brass. More significantly, the firing pin impressions matched the pattern from Rogers' service weapon. The bullet that created this shell casing had been fired from Officer James Rogers' gun. Sullivan stared at the lab report for a long time, trying to process what it meant. If Rogers had fired his weapon on the day he disappeared, why hadn't anyone heard the shot? Why hadn't he called for backup? What had he been shooting at? And most disturbing of all, why had the casing ended up buried in the sand at the base of Devil's Slide? The discovery raised more questions than it answered, but it also confirmed what Sullivan had suspected all along. Rogers hadn't simply wandered off or fallen from the cliff. Something violent had happened that morning, something that someone had gone to great lengths to cover up. When Clara Moreno walked into the sheriff's department on Monday morning, she looked exactly as Sullivan remembered her, only older. Her dark hair was streaked with silver now, and there were lines around her eyes that spoke of too many late nights spent reviewing case files. But her gaze was still sharp and penetrating, the look of someone who noticed details that others missed. Sullivan handed her the lab report and watched her face as she read it. Her expression didn't change, but he saw her grip tighten slightly on the paper. After a moment, she looked up and asked to see the complete case file. They spent the morning in the conference room, with Moreno carefully reviewing every document, every photograph, every witness statement from the original investigation. She asked detailed questions about the timeline, about Rogers' state of mind in the days before his disappearance, about any unusual activity in the area around that time. When she finished reading, Moreno leaned back in her chair and was quiet for several minutes. Sullivan could almost see her mind working, processing the information and looking for patterns that others had missed. Finally, she spoke. 13 years, she said quietly. 13 years. And this is the first piece of evidence we've found. That's not random. That's not an accident. Sullivan waited for her to continue. Someone wanted that shell casing to disappear forever, Moreno said. They buried it in a place where they thought it would never be found. But the ocean doesn't keep secrets forever. It gives them back when you least expect it. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out toward the coastal mountains where Devil's Slide carved its dangerous path along the cliffs. James fired his weapon that morning, she continued. The question is whether he was defending himself or attacking someone else. And if someone else was involved, they're still out there. They've been living with this secret for 13 years. Moreno turned back to Sullivan, and he saw something in her eyes that made him uncomfortable. It was the look of someone who'd seen too much, who understood that the truth wasn't always clean or simple. We're going to find out what happened, she said. But I need you to understand something before we start. Some secrets are buried for good reasons. Some truths are more dangerous than the lies that cover them. Sullivan nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood what she meant. Are you prepared for that possibility? Moreno asked. Before Sullivan could answer, Moreno's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something about it seemed familiar. She answered cautiously. The voice on the other end was distorted, obviously disguised, but the message was clear and chilling. Stop digging into things that should stay buried. Some people won't appreciate your curiosity. The line went dead, leaving Moreno staring at her phone in the sudden silence of the conference room. Sullivan saw the color drain from her face and asked what was wrong. Moreno looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked genuinely frightened. Someone knows we're investigating, she said quietly, and they don't want us to continue. She walked back to the window and stared out at Devil's Slide, now barely visible through the afternoon haze. Somewhere out there, buried deeper than any shell casing, was a truth that someone was willing to kill to protect. Clara Moreno had received threatening calls before. In her line of work, stepping on powerful toes was an occupational hazard. But this call felt different. The timing was too precise, the knowledge too specific. Someone had been watching the investigation from the very beginning, monitoring every move, every development. That level of surveillance suggested resources and connections that went far beyond ordinary criminal activity. After the call, Moreno insisted that she and Sullivan move their base of operations away from the sheriff's department. If someone was monitoring their activities, the department building was compromised. Too many people had access. Too many ears could overhear conversations. They needed somewhere private, somewhere secure, somewhere that whoever was watching wouldn't expect them to go. Moreno rented a small office space in downtown Half Moon Bay, paying cash for a month-to-month lease. It was above a tackle shop, with windows that looked out over the harbor where Miguel Santos kept his fishing boat. The irony wasn't lost on her. The man who'd found the shell casing worked just below where they were trying to piece together its significance. The first thing Moreno did was create a comprehensive timeline of Rogers' last day. She'd studied the original investigation files, but she wanted to reconstruct every minute from a fresh perspective. Sometimes the most important details were hidden in the gaps between known facts. Rogers had clocked in at 6:30 a.m. on March 15, 1977. His first radio check was at 6:45, confirming he was beginning his patrol route. At 7:15, he'd called in his location at Devil's Slide, southbound. That was the last confirmed contact. But what had happened between 7:15 and 8:00 when he'd failed to make his scheduled check-in? Moreno spent hours studying topographical maps of the area, trying to understand the geography that Rogers would have encountered. Devil's Slide was more than just a dangerous stretch of highway. It was a corridor between two worlds. To the east, the coastal mountains rose sharply, covered in dense forests that could hide almost anything. To the west, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its depths capable of swallowing secrets forever. The section of highway where Rogers' patrol car had been found was particularly isolated. There were no houses, no businesses, no regular foot traffic. The nearest residence was more than 2 miles away. If someone had wanted to confront a police officer without witnesses, it would have been an ideal location. But that raised another question. How would anyone have known that Rogers would be there at that specific time? His patrol route was standard procedure, but the exact timing varied depending on traffic and weather conditions. Either Rogers had been followed, or someone had inside knowledge of his routine. Moreno decided to start by re-interviewing everyone who'd been connected to the original investigation. 13 years was a long time. People's perspectives changed. Details that seemed unimportant in 1977 might have gained significance with the passage of time. Fear that had kept people silent might have faded, replaced by guilt or the simple human need to tell the truth. Her first stop was Martha Rogers. The widow still lived in the same house on Pine Street, though it had aged considerably since her husband's disappearance. The paint was faded, the garden overgrown. Martha herself looked fragile, as if the years of uncertainty had worn her down to her essential elements. When Moreno knocked on the door, Martha's face lit up with something that might have been hope. She'd been following the news about the shell casing discovery, waiting for someone to contact her about the renewed investigation. She invited Moreno in with the eagerness of someone who'd been waiting 13 years for this conversation. The house was exactly as Moreno remembered it from her visits during the original investigation, only more so. Photos of James Rogers covered every surface. His coffee cup still sat on the kitchen counter, never moved from where Martha had left it the morning he disappeared. His patrol hat hung on a hook by the door, waiting for him to come home from his shift. Martha made coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. She wanted to know everything about the shell casing. Where exactly had it been found? How could they be sure it was from James's gun? What did it mean for the investigation? Moreno answered what questions she could, but she was more interested in hearing Martha's perspective. Had James mentioned anything unusual in the days before his disappearance? Any new cases he was working on? Any problems with other officers or members of the public? Martha shook her head to all of these questions, just as she had 13 years earlier. James had been his usual self in the weeks before he vanished. Quiet, dedicated, focused on his work. He'd been looking forward to their upcoming vacation to Lake Tahoe. They'd been planning to try fishing, something James had never done but wanted to learn. But as they talked, Martha mentioned something that hadn't been in the original case files. About a week before James disappeared, he'd received a phone call at home that had seemed to upset him. Martha had only heard his side of the conversation, but it had sounded official. Someone asking him about a case or an incident. When she'd asked him about it afterward, James had brushed off her concerns, saying it was just routine police business. This was new information, and Moreno felt her pulse quicken. Phone calls from headquarters were usually logged and documented. If James had been contacted about a case, there should be a record of it somewhere. But she'd been through all the department files, and there was no mention of any such contact. Moreno asked Martha if she could remember anything specific about the conversation. Any names mentioned? Any details that had stuck with her? Martha closed her eyes, trying to recall that night 13 years ago. He kept saying, "I understand," and "Yes, sir," Martha said slowly, like he was talking to someone with authority. A supervisor, maybe. But it was late, almost 9 o'clock. James usually didn't get work calls at home unless it was an emergency. After thanking Martha for her time, Moreno drove to the sheriff's department to check the personnel records. She needed to know who would have had the authority to call Rogers at home, and what cases might have warranted such contact. The personnel files from 1977 revealed that Rogers had been working under Sergeant Bill Hammond, the same supervisor who'd found his abandoned patrol car. Hammond had retired in 1985 and moved to Oregon, but Moreno was able to track down his current address and phone number. When she called Hammond, his voice was gruff, but cooperative. He remembered the Rogers case clearly, he said. It had been the worst thing that happened during his entire career. A good officer vanishing without a trace, the kind of thing that haunted a supervisor forever. But when Moreno asked about phone calls to Rogers' home, Hammond's tone changed. He became more cautious, more guarded. He claimed he'd never called Rogers at home, especially not in the evening. Department policy discouraged after-hours contact unless it was truly urgent. Moreno pressed him about what cases Rogers had been working on in the weeks before his disappearance. Had there been anything sensitive or controversial? Anything that might have put Rogers in danger? Hammond was quiet for a long moment before answering. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There was something," he said, "but I was told to keep it out of the official reports. Orders from higher up." Moreno's grip tightened on the phone. What kind of something? Rogers had been asking questions about a drug bust that went wrong. Big shipment that was supposed to come in through the harbor. Someone tipped off the smugglers, and the whole operation went sideways. Rogers thought there might have been corruption involved. He was poking around trying to figure out who leaked the information. This was the first Moreno had heard about any drug investigation. She'd been through all of Rogers' case files, and there was no mention of smuggling or corruption. Either the files had been sanitized, or Rogers had been working on something unofficial. Hammond continued reluctantly. The brass didn't want any talk about corruption in the department. Bad for morale, bad for public confidence. They told Rogers to drop it, but you know how he was. Once he got his teeth into something, he didn't let go. After hanging up with Hammond, Moreno sat in her car outside the sheriff's department, processing what she'd learned. Rogers hadn't just stumbled into danger. He'd been actively investigating something that powerful people wanted kept secret, something involving drug smuggling and police corruption. The pieces were starting to form a pattern, but it was a pattern that made Moreno deeply uncomfortable. If Rogers had been killed because of his investigation into corruption, it meant that someone in law enforcement had been involved in his death. Someone with the authority to suppress evidence and silence witnesses. She drove back to her rented office, her mind racing with possibilities. As she climbed the stairs above the tackle shop, she noticed that the door to her office was slightly ajar. She was certain she'd locked it when she left. Moreno drew her concealed pistol and approached the door carefully. The office had been searched, not ransacked, but thoroughly and professionally examined. Whoever had been there knew what they were doing. Files had been moved and replaced, but not quite in their original positions. Her computer had been turned on and accessed. Even her briefcase showed signs of being opened and searched, but the most disturbing discovery was what the intruders had left behind. On her desk, placed carefully in the center, was a single photograph. It showed Rogers' patrol car on the morning he disappeared, taken from an angle that didn't match any of the official crime scene photos. This picture had been taken by someone who was there before the police arrived, someone who had known what was going to happen. On the back of the photograph, written in neat block letters, was a message. "He got too close, don't make the same mistake." Moreno stared at the photograph for a long time, her hands shaking slightly. The image showed something that none of the official photos had captured. In the background, partially hidden by fog, was another vehicle, a dark sedan parked on the shoulder about 100 yards away from Rogers' patrol car. Someone else had been at Devil's Slide that morning. Someone who had been watching when Rogers disappeared. Someone who had taken this photograph as proof of what they'd done. Moreno immediately called Sullivan and told him about the break-in and the photograph. His reaction was swift and decisive. If someone was willing to commit burglary to interfere with the investigation, they were dealing with people who had both resources and desperation. The case was more dangerous than either of them had realized. Sullivan suggested that Moreno should consider backing away from the investigation, let the department handle it from here. But Moreno refused. She'd known James Rogers. She'd worked with him, trusted him, respected him. If he died because he was trying to expose corruption, then finishing his work was a matter of honor. Instead of retreating, Moreno decided to accelerate her investigation. Someone was clearly nervous about what she might discover. That nervousness could be used as a weapon if she played it correctly. She started by researching the drug smuggling operation that Hammond had mentioned. Using contacts from her private investigation business, she was able to access DEA files and federal court records from the late 1970s. What she found was disturbing. In early 1977, federal agents had been tracking a major heroin smuggling ring operating along the California coast. The organization was sophisticated, using fishing boats and private aircraft to move drugs from Mexico into the United States. The DEA had been planning a coordinated raid for months, working with local law enforcement to identify landing sites and distribution networks. But when the raids finally took place in February 1977, just weeks before Rogers disappeared, they found nothing. Every location had been abandoned. Every contact had vanished. Someone with inside knowledge had warned the smugglers, allowing them to escape with millions of dollars worth of heroin. The DEA investigation into the leaked information had stalled quickly. No evidence of corruption was found. No charges were filed. The case was quietly closed and sealed. But reading between the lines of the heavily redacted reports, Moreno could see that federal agents had suspected local law enforcement of being involved. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Rogers disappears just weeks after a major drug operation is compromised by a suspected police leak. He'd been asking questions about corruption. Someone had called him at home to discuss an unofficial case, and now someone was willing to commit crimes to stop the current investigation. Moreno was beginning to understand what Rogers had stumbled into, a conspiracy that reached high enough to protect itself and deep enough to eliminate threats. A network of corruption that had survived for 13 years by keeping its secrets buried. But the photograph bothered her most of all. Someone had been there when Rogers died. Someone had watched it happen and documented it. That level of cold-blooded calculation suggested professional killers, not corrupt cops acting in panic. As evening fell over Half Moon Bay, Moreno sat in her compromised office, studying the photograph under a magnifying glass. The dark sedan in the background was too distant to make out license plates or specific details, but something about its shape seemed familiar. She was so absorbed in the image that she almost missed the sound of footsteps on the stairs outside her office. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, coming up slowly, as if the person climbing them didn't want to be heard. Moreno quietly moved away from her desk and positioned herself behind the door, her pistol ready. The footsteps stopped just outside. She could hear breathing in the hallway. Someone was standing there, listening, waiting. Then her phone rang, shattering the silence. The caller ID showed Sullivan's number. "Clara, get out of there right now." His voice was urgent, almost panicked. "I just got word that someone's been asking questions about you. Official questions. People who shouldn't know about our investigation." The footsteps in the hallway started moving again, faster now, heading back down the stairs. Moreno heard a door slam and the sound of a car engine starting in the alley behind the building. "Someone was just here," she told Sullivan, watching, waiting. "Pack everything and get out," Sullivan said. "We'll meet at the safe house I've arranged." "I think we're in deeper than we realized." As Moreno quickly gathered her files and the threatening photograph, she realized that Rogers' investigation had led him into something much larger and more dangerous than police corruption, something that was still active 13 years later, something that powerful people would kill to protect, and now she was walking the same path that had led to his death. The safe house Sullivan had arranged was a cabin in the Santa Cruz Mountains, 20 miles inland from the coast, and accessible only by a winding dirt road that discouraged casual visitors. It belonged to a retired FBI agent named Tom Castellanos, who owed Sullivan a favor from an old case. Castellanos had built the place specifically for situations like this, complete with secure communications equipment and enough isolation to make surveillance difficult. Clara Moreno arrived at the cabin just after midnight, her nerves frayed from checking her rearview mirror every few seconds during the drive. She'd taken a circuitous route through back roads, switching directions multiple times to ensure she wasn't being followed. The threatening photograph and the mysterious visitor to her office had changed everything. This was no longer just a cold case investigation. It was a matter of survival. Sullivan was already waiting when she arrived, along with Castellanos. The former FBI agent was a small, weathered man in his 60s who moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades being careful about everything. His introduction was brief and businesslike, He'd worked organized crime cases for 30 years, he said, and he recognized the signs of institutional corruption when he saw them. "How your friend Rogers stumbled into something big," Castellanos said, as they settled into the cabin's main room. "The kind of thing that doesn't just go away because one cop disappears. It adapts, it evolves, it protects itself." Moreno spread the case files and photographs across the cabin's kitchen table, creating a visual timeline of everything they'd discovered. The shell casing, Rogers' unofficial investigation into drug smuggling, the mysterious phone call to his home, the professionally executed search of her office, the threatening photograph that proved someone else had been at Devil's Slide that morning. Castellanos studied the materials with the intensity of someone reading tea leaves. He asked detailed questions about the DEA investigation, about the timeline of the failed drug raids, about the specific people who would have had access to the operational intelligence that was leaked. "The thing about corruption," Castellanos said, "is that it's like cancer. It doesn't stay contained. It spreads through an organization, creating networks of compromised people who protect each other out of mutual self-interest. Your officer Rogers wasn't just investigating a single corrupt cop. He was threatening an entire system." Sullivan had brought additional files from the sheriff's department, including personnel records and case assignments from 1977. He'd been careful to access them without drawing attention, but he knew that their window of opportunity was closing. If someone inside the department was monitoring their investigation, it wouldn't take long to discover what files had been accessed. Working through the night, they began to construct a more complete picture of what Rogers had been investigating. The drug smuggling operation hadn't been a one-time thing. It had been part of a larger network that used the remote coastline of San Mateo County as a pipeline for narcotics flowing north from Mexico. The operation was sophisticated, involving corrupt officials at multiple levels of government, port inspectors who looked the other way when certain boats arrived, customs agents who happened to be absent when specific flights landed at private airstrips, and local law enforcement officers who provided intelligence about DEA activities and federal investigations. Moreno found the connection she'd been looking for in a case file that Rogers had worked just 2 weeks before his disappearance. A routine traffic stop that had turned into something much more significant. Rogers had pulled over a speeding car on Highway 1, just south of Devil's Slide. The driver had been nervous, evasive, clearly hiding something. A search of the vehicle had revealed a hidden compartment containing $50,000 in cash and a police radio scanner. The driver, a man named Vincent Torino, had been arrested and charged with possession of drug-related assets, but according to the file, the charges had been dropped 3 days later due to procedural irregularities. Castellanos recognized Torino's name immediately. He'd been a subject of FBI surveillance in the late 1970s, suspected of being a courier for organized crime drug operations. But Torino had always managed to avoid serious charges, usually due to evidence being mishandled or witnesses becoming uncooperative. Someone was protecting him, Castellanos said. Someone with enough influence to make charges disappear. That's not the kind of thing a low-level corrupt cop can pull off. That requires institutional power. The more they dug into the case files, the more disturbing the pattern became. Rogers hadn't just been investigating corruption. He'd been building a comprehensive case against an organized conspiracy. His files contained detailed notes about suspicious case dismissals, evidence that had mysteriously disappeared, and witness statements that had been altered or suppressed. But Rogers had been careful about who he shared his suspicions with. His notes were coded, using initials and references that would be meaningless to anyone who didn't understand the context. He'd known he was dealing with people who had access to official information, so he'd kept his real investigations separate from his official duties. Moreno found herself admiring Rogers' methodical approach, even as she mourned his fate. He'd been building an airtight case, documenting everything, preparing for the day when he could present his evidence to federal authorities. But someone had discovered what he was doing before he could complete his work. The breakthrough came when Castellanos noticed something in the photograph that had been left on Moreno's desk. The angle from which it had been taken suggested that the photographer had been positioned on higher ground, looking down at the scene. There was only one place near Devil's Slide where someone could have achieved that vantage point. Using topographical maps, they identified a fire road that ran parallel to Highway 1, about 200 feet higher in elevation. The road was used by forestry service vehicles, and wasn't visible from the highway below. Someone familiar with the area could have parked there undetected and watched everything that happened at Rogers' patrol car. Sullivan suggested they visit the site to see what they could learn. If the photograph had been taken from that fire road, there might be other evidence there. Shell casings, tire tracks, anything that could help identify who had been watching that morning. But Castellanos shook his head. "They're expecting that," he said. "They know you have the photograph. They know you'll figure out where it was taken. If you go there now, you'll be walking into a trap." Instead, Castellanos suggested a different approach. If they could identify the car in the photograph, they might be able to trace it back to its owner. The image was grainy and distant, but modern computer enhancement techniques might be able to extract more detail than was visible to the naked eye. Moreno had contacts in the private sector who specialized in digital image analysis. People who worked with insurance companies and law firms to enhance surveillance footage and accident scene photos. It would take time and money, but it might be their best chance of identifying the mysterious vehicle. While they waited for the image analysis results, Moreno decided to take a different approach to the investigation. Instead of focusing on the official case files, she would try to track down the people who had been involved in the original smuggling operation. Drug dealers had long memories and loose tongues. Someone might be willing to talk about events from 13 years ago, especially if they thought it might help them with current legal problems. She started with Vincent Torino, the man Rogers had arrested just before his disappearance. Torino was still alive, serving time in federal prison for drug trafficking charges that had finally stuck in the mid-1980s. According to his prison records, he'd been a model prisoner, keeping his head down and avoiding trouble. But he was scheduled for parole in 2 years, which meant he might be motivated to cooperate if it could help his case. Arranging a prison visit took several days and required calling in favors with federal marshals and prison administrators. But Moreno had built her private investigation business on knowing the right people and understanding how the system worked. By Thursday morning, she was sitting across from Vincent Torino in the visiting room of Lompoc Federal Correctional Institution. Torino was in his 50s now, gray-haired and soft around the middle, but his eyes still held the wariness of someone who'd lived on the wrong side of the law for most of his adult life. When Moreno mentioned Rogers' name, she saw recognition flash across his face. Fear, too. "I don't know nothing about no cop," Torino said automatically. It was the response of someone who'd spent decades avoiding law enforcement questions. But Moreno had interviewed enough criminals to recognize when someone was lying out of habit rather than conviction. She showed him the photograph of Rogers' abandoned patrol car, watching his reaction carefully. Torino studied the image for a long time, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, there was something different in his eyes. Not fear this time, but calculation. "That cop was asking the wrong questions to the wrong people," Torino said quietly. "Questions about things that weren't his business." Moreno pressed him for details. What kind of questions? Who was Rogers talking to? What had he discovered that made him dangerous? Torino glanced around the visiting room, making sure no one was close enough to overhear their conversation. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There was a network," he said. "People in uniform, people in suits, people who made things happen. Rogers thought he was investigating drug smuggling, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. The real money was in protection, making sure certain people never got arrested, certain evidence never made it to trial, certain witnesses never testified. According to Torino, the corruption network had included not just local police, but federal agents, prosecutors, and judges. It had been operating for years before Rogers stumbled onto it, and it had continued operating long after his death. The drug smuggling was just one of many illegal activities that the network facilitated. Rogers had names, Torino continued, real names of real people, high-level people, the kind of people who could make problems disappear permanently. Moreno asked if Torino knew what had happened to Rogers' evidence. Had he completed his investigation before he was killed? Where would he have hidden documentation that sensitive? Torino was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his options. Finally, he made his decision. Rogers was smart, he said. He knew he couldn't trust anyone in law enforcement, so he made copies of everything and hid them where no one would think to look. Insurance, he called it. Protection in case something happened to him. The implications hit Moreno like a physical blow. If Rogers had hidden evidence of the corruption network, it might still exist. 13 years later, That evidence could still bring down the people responsible for his death. But Torino's next words dampened her excitement. Problem is, Rogers never told anyone where he hid the evidence. He was supposed to retrieve it after he made his case to the feds, but he died before that could happen. Moreno left the prison with more questions than answers. Rogers had apparently assembled comprehensive evidence of a major corruption conspiracy, but that evidence was hidden somewhere that had remained undiscovered for 13 years. Finding it would require understanding not just what Rogers was investigating, but how he thought, where he would have felt safe hiding something so dangerous. The drive back to the safe house gave her time to process what she'd learned. The conspiracy was larger and more sophisticated than she'd imagined. It had survived Rogers' death and continued operating for over a decade. The people behind it had institutional power and professional resources. They'd proven they were willing to kill to protect their secrets, but they'd also made a mistake by threatening her so directly. The break-in at her office, the intimidating photograph, the warning message, all of it suggested that they were worried about what she might discover. That worry could be exploited if she was clever enough and careful enough. When she arrived back at the cabin, Sullivan and Castellanos were waiting with news of their own. The image enhancement analysis had come back, and the results were more revealing than anyone had expected. The dark sedan in the background of the photograph wasn't just any car. It was a government vehicle, specifically a model used by federal law enforcement agencies in the late 1970s. The license plate was partially visible, and although it was too degraded to read completely, the format matched that used by the DEA for undercover operations. Someone from the Drug Enforcement Administration had been at Devil's Slide when Rogers disappeared. Someone who had watched him die and photographed the scene as evidence of their success. The revelation changed everything. This wasn't just about local corruption anymore. Federal agents had been involved in Rogers' murder, which meant the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of law enforcement. It also meant that the people they were investigating had resources and authority that Moreno had never imagined. As night fell over the mountains, the three investigators sat around the cabin's kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that had killed one cop and was now threatening to kill them. The scope of what they were facing was overwhelming, but Moreno felt a strange sense of clarity. Rogers had died trying to expose the truth. His evidence was still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. And despite the danger, despite the threats, despite the overwhelming odds against them, she was going to find it. The people who had killed Rogers thought they were safe because they had power and influence. But they had underestimated the determination of a woman who refused to let her friend's death go unanswered. Somewhere in the darkness outside the cabin, Moreno knew they were being watched. The corruption network had resources and patience. They would wait for the right moment to strike, just as they had with Rogers 13 years ago. But this time, they wouldn't have the element of surprise. Clara Moreno knew that finding Rogers' hidden evidence would require thinking like him. She'd worked alongside James for 6 months before his disappearance, long enough to understand his methodical nature and his deep-seated caution. He wasn't the type of person to make impulsive decisions or take unnecessary risks. If he'd hidden evidence of a major conspiracy, he would have chosen a location that was both secure and accessible, somewhere he could retrieve it quickly if needed, but where it would remain safe indefinitely if something happened to him. The challenge was that Rogers had been planning for contingencies that most cops never had to consider. He couldn't trust his fellow officers, his supervisors, or even federal agents. He needed a hiding place that was completely outside the law enforcement system, somewhere that corrupt officials would never think to look. Moreno spent the early morning hours at the cabin reviewing everything she knew about Rogers' personal life, his habits, his interests, his relationships outside of work. The answer had to be there somewhere, buried in the details of how he lived his life away from the badge and the uniform. Martha Rogers had mentioned that James was looking forward to their planned fishing trip to Lake Tahoe. It was something he'd never done before but wanted to try. That suggested a man who was thinking about the future, making plans beyond his current investigation. But it also suggested someone who was expanding his horizons, exploring new possibilities. Moreno called Martha from the secure phone at the cabin, asking her to think more carefully about James's activities in the weeks before his disappearance. Had he gone anywhere unusual, met with anyone unexpected, changed any of his routines? Martha was quiet for a long time, searching her memory for details that might have seemed insignificant 13 years ago. Finally, she remembered something. "He went to the library," she said, "the main branch in San Francisco. It was unusual because James never read much, and he certainly never went to libraries, but he said he was researching something for work. He went there twice, maybe 3 times in the month before he disappeared. Libraries were perfect hiding places for someone who understood how to use them. They were public spaces with minimal security, but they also had thousands of potential hiding spots. Books, periodicals, filing systems, storage areas. Someone could hide documents in a library and be reasonably confident they would remain undisturbed for years. But which library? San Francisco had dozens of branches, and without knowing specifically where Rogers had gone, they could spend weeks searching without finding anything. Moreno asked Martha if she could remember any other details about these library visits. "He always came back with photocopies," Martha said. "Legal-sized papers, usually, and he kept them in a box in our spare bedroom. I asked him about it once, but he just said it was case research, background information. The photocopies were gone now," Martha explained. She'd thrown out most of James's police-related materials years ago, unable to bear the constant reminders of his unfinished work. But she might still have receipts or other documentation that could indicate which library he'd been visiting. While Martha searched her records, Moreno turned her attention to another angle. If Rogers had been building a case against federal agents, he would have needed documentary evidence. Surveillance reports, operational plans, communication records. That kind of material wouldn't have been available through normal law enforcement channels. He would have needed a source inside the federal system. Castellanos had mentioned that the DEA investigation into the failed drug raids had been quietly closed without charges. But federal investigations generated massive amounts of paperwork, even when they were terminated. Reports, interviews, evidence logs, surveillance summaries, all of that material would have been filed somewhere, and someone with the right access could have made copies. The breakthrough came when Sullivan called with information from his own investigation into the personnel records. He'd been checking the backgrounds of everyone who'd been involved in the Rogers case, looking for connections to federal agencies or unusual career patterns. "I found something interesting about Bill Hammond," Sullivan said, Rogers' supervisor. Before he joined the sheriff's department, he worked for the DEA for 8 years. He transferred to local law enforcement in 1975, just 2 years before Rogers disappeared. The timing was suspicious. Hammond had left federal service right around the time that the drug smuggling network was establishing itself along the California coast. His transfer to local law enforcement would have given him access to information about local investigations while maintaining his connections to federal agents. More importantly, Hammond would have known how federal investigations worked, how evidence was processed and stored, how to access materials that were supposed to be classified. If Rogers had needed inside information about the DEA's activities, Hammond was in a perfect position to provide it. But that raised a disturbing question. If Hammond had been Rogers' source for federal information, why hadn't he mentioned it during the original investigation? And why had he seemed so evasive when Moreno had questioned him about Rogers' unofficial activities? Moreno decided it was time for another conversation with the former sergeant. This time, she wouldn't accept vague answers or claims of ignorance. Too much was at stake and too many people had already died for the truth. But when she tried to reach Hammond at his Oregon home, the phone had been disconnected. Directory assistants had no new listing for him. According to neighbors that Sullivan contacted, Hammond had left town suddenly about a week ago, claiming he was taking an extended vacation. He'd given no forwarding address and no indication of when he might return. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Hammond had disappeared right around the time that Moreno had started asking questions about Rogers' investigation. Either he was running from something, or someone had made him disappear. Castellanos suggested they check federal databases to see if Hammond was traveling under his own name. If he was involved in the conspiracy, he might have access to false identification or federal protection. But those searches would take time, and Moreno wasn't sure they had time to spare. The answer came from an unexpected source. Martha Rogers called back with information about the library visits. She'd found a parking receipt from the San Francisco Main Library, dated 2 weeks before James's disappearance. More importantly, she'd remembered something else about his library research. He was looking up old newspaper articles, Martha said, stories about drug arrests and federal investigations. He said he was trying to understand the patterns. how certain cases were handled differently than others. The San Francisco Main Library had an extensive archive of historical newspapers, including detailed coverage of federal drug enforcement activities from the 1970s. If Rogers had been researching the corruption network, the newspaper archive would have been an invaluable resource. It would also have been the perfect place to hide copies of sensitive documents. Moreno, Sullivan, and Castellanos made the drive to San Francisco that afternoon, traveling in separate vehicles and taking different routes to avoid being followed. The library was a massive granite building in the Civic Center, with reading rooms that could accommodate hundreds of researchers and archival collections that filled multiple floors. The newspaper archive was located in the basement, accessed through a maze of corridors and storage areas that felt more like a bunker than a public facility. The librarian on duty was an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who'd been working in the archives for over 20 years. She remembered patrons who were serious researchers, and she definitely remembered James Rogers. He was very methodical, Mrs. Chen said, always requested the same types of materials. Drug enforcement stories, federal court proceedings, anything related to corruption investigations. He came in regularly for about a month, always sat at the same table in the back corner. She led them to the table where Rogers had worked, a heavy wooden desk positioned near the reference stacks and away from the main reading area. It was the kind of spot where someone could work without being observed, where they could review sensitive materials without attracting attention. But the table itself revealed nothing unusual. If Rogers had hidden anything there, it had been discovered and removed long ago. Moreno was beginning to think they were pursuing another dead end, when Mrs. Chen mentioned something that changed everything. He always checked out the same microfilm reel, she said, San Francisco Chronicle coverage of federal court cases from 1976 and 1977, but he never actually used the microfilm readers. He said he preferred to work with photocopies. Mrs. Chen led them to the microfilm storage area, a climate-controlled room filled with thousands of reels containing decades of newspaper archives. The reels that Rogers had repeatedly requested were stored in a section dedicated to federal court coverage, filed by date and publication. Castellanos examined the storage system carefully. Each reel was contained in a small metal canister, labeled with catalog numbers and filing dates. But some of the canisters felt slightly heavier than others, and when he opened one of the reels that Rogers had frequently requested, he found more than just microfilm. Taped to the inside of the canister was a small envelope containing a key and a handwritten note. The note was in Rogers' careful handwriting. SF Examiner Morgue, Section M7, Box 341. Insurance policy for Jr. The San Francisco Examiner Morgue was the newspaper's archive of old stories and research materials, located in a warehouse facility across town. It was the kind of place where information could be stored indefinitely without anyone questioning its presence. More importantly, it was a private facility with minimal security, the perfect location for someone who needed to hide sensitive documents. But getting access to the Examiner Morgue would require careful planning. Unlike the public library, the newspaper archive was private property with restricted access. They would need either official credentials or inside help to search the facility without attracting attention. Sullivan had contacts in the media from his years in law enforcement, reporters who'd covered crime stories and developed relationships with police sources. One of them was Maria Santos, an investigative journalist who'd been pursuing her own stories about federal corruption for years. She might be willing to help if she understood what they were looking for. When Sullivan called Santos and explained the situation, her response was immediate and enthusiastic. She'd been investigating rumors about DEA corruption for months without finding solid evidence. If Rogers had documented proof of federal involvement in drug smuggling and murder, it would be the biggest story of her career. Santos arranged to meet them at the Examiner Morgue that evening, after the facility was closed to regular visitors. She had legitimate access to the archives as part of her ongoing research, and she could get them inside without arousing suspicion. The warehouse was a cavernous building filled with filing cabinets, storage boxes, and old printing equipment. Section M7 was located on the second floor, in an area devoted to materials from the late 1970s. Box 341 was tucked away in a corner, covered with dust and apparently untouched for years. Inside the box, beneath stacks of old newspaper clippings and research notes, They found what Rogers had hidden: a manila envelope containing photocopies of federal surveillance reports, DEA operational plans, and internal memos documenting the corruption network that had protected drug smugglers for years. The evidence was comprehensive and damning. It included names, dates, amounts of money, and detailed descriptions of how federal agents had sabotaged their own investigations in exchange for bribes. But the most shocking revelation was the scope of the conspiracy. It hadn't been limited to drug enforcement. The corruption network had infiltrated multiple federal agencies, providing protection for organized crime activities ranging from money laundering to arms trafficking. Prosecutors had thrown cases, judges had issued favorable rulings, and federal agents had provided intelligence to the very criminals they were supposed to be arresting. At the center of it all was a man named Robert Kellerman, a senior DEA administrator who'd been coordinating the corruption network from his office in Washington, D.C. Kellerman had been using his position to identify federal investigations that threatened the network's interests, then ensuring that those investigations failed through strategic leaks and misdirection. According to Rogers' notes, Kellerman had learned about the local investigation into police corruption and had ordered Rogers' elimination before he could present his evidence to honest federal authorities. The DEA agent who'd photographed Rogers' murder scene had been acting on Kellerman's direct orders. But the most disturbing revelation was that Kellerman was still active in 1990. He'd been promoted within the DEA hierarchy and was now in a position to coordinate even more extensive corruption activities. The network that had killed Rogers was stronger than ever, with tentacles reaching into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. As they photographed Rogers' evidence and prepared to leave the warehouse, Moreno realized that they now faced an impossible choice. They had proof of massive federal corruption, but presenting that proof to authorities would be suicide. How could they trust any federal agency when they didn't know how far the corruption extended? The answer came from Maria Santos. As an investigative journalist, she had access to media outlets and political contacts who could publicize the evidence without going through compromised law enforcement channels. If the story was published simultaneously by multiple news organizations, it would be too big to suppress or cover up. But Santos warned them that going public would make them targets for assassination. The people they were exposing had killed before and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Once the story broke, they would all be in mortal danger. As they prepared to leave the Examiner morgue, Castellanos noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the parking lot outside, a dark sedan was positioned where it could monitor the building's exits, the same type of car that had been photographed at Devil's Slide 13 years ago. They'd been found. The corruption network had tracked them to Rogers' hidden evidence, and now they were trapped in the warehouse with nowhere to run. The people who'd killed Rogers were about to claim 3 more victims. The warehouse had multiple exits, but Castellanos knew that professional killers would have positioned themselves to cover all escape routes. These weren't street criminals acting on impulse. These were federal agents with resources, training, and a 13-year track record of eliminating threats to their operation. "There's a loading dock on the east side," Maria Santos whispered, her voice tight with fear. "It connects to an alley that runs behind the adjacent buildings. If we can get there without being seen, we might have a chance." Moreno clutched the manila envelope containing Rogers' evidence, the documentation that had cost one man his life and might soon cost them theirs. But she also felt a grim satisfaction. After 13 years, the truth about James Rogers' murder was finally going to see daylight. Even if none of them survived the night, the evidence would find its way to people who could use it. Sullivan had already called for backup on his radio, but they all knew that help might not arrive in time. And given what they'd learned about the extent of the corruption, they couldn't be certain that the responding officers wouldn't be compromised as well. Trust had become a luxury they couldn't afford. They moved through the warehouse carefully, using the tall storage racks as cover while making their way toward the loading dock. The building's security lighting created patches of illumination and shadow that could either hide them or expose them, depending on timing and luck. Castellanos led the way, his decades of FBI experience evident in how he moved and assessed potential threats. He'd survived dangerous situations before by being methodical and paranoid, and those instincts were serving him well now. Every corner was a potential ambush point. Every sound could signal approaching danger. They were halfway to the loading dock when the warehouse lights suddenly went out, plunging them into near-total darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in seconds later, but the dim red glow only made the shadows deeper and more threatening. Someone had cut the main power, which meant the killers were already inside the building. "They're hurting us," Castellanos whispered, "forcing us toward a specific exit where they can control the encounter." But Moreno had spent too many years investigating crimes to be easily manipulated. If their enemies wanted to control the situation, she would do something unexpected. Instead of heading for the obvious exits, she led the group deeper into the warehouse, toward the areas where old printing equipment created a maze of potential hiding spots. The sound of footsteps echoed through the building. Multiple sets, moving with military precision. These weren't local cops or DEA agents acting alone. This was a coordinated operation involving people with serious tactical training. Sullivan's radio crackled with incoming calls, but the voices were unfamiliar. Either backup was finally arriving, or the corrupt agents were using police frequencies to coordinate their attack. Without knowing which was true, responding to the radio calls would be suicidal. They found temporary shelter behind a massive offset printing press, its bulk providing cover from multiple directions, but Moreno knew they couldn't hide indefinitely. Their enemies had superior numbers, better equipment, and intimate knowledge of how to conduct this type of operation. "We need to separate," she said quietly. "If we're all together, they can eliminate us with a single coordinated attack. But if we split up, at least some of us might escape with the evidence." Santos volunteered to take the original documents and try to reach her news organization. As a journalist, she had the best chance of getting the story published, even if something happened to the others. But Moreno insisted on keeping photocopies of the most important materials. If one set of evidence was lost, they needed backup documentation. Castellanos pulled out his service weapon and checked the ammunition. He'd been retired for years, but he still carried the .45 caliber pistol that had been his companion through decades of dangerous investigations. It felt familiar and reassuring in his hands, even though he knew that firepower alone wouldn't save them. The footsteps were getting closer now, accompanied by the sound of equipment being moved and positioned. Their hunters were setting up a perimeter, closing off escape routes while preparing to sweep the warehouse systematically. It was a professional operation, conducted by people who'd done this type of thing before. Moreno thought about James Rogers, about the morning 13 years ago when he'd faced a similar situation. He'd been alone on Devil's Slide, confronted by federal agents who'd decided he was too dangerous to live. He'd managed to fire his weapon at least once, leaving behind the shell casing that had eventually led to this moment, but he hadn't been able to escape or call for help. She wasn't going to make the same mistake. Using her cell phone, Moreno called the news desk at the San Francisco Chronicle, one of the newspapers that Santos had mentioned as a potential outlet for the story. She spoke quickly and quietly, identifying herself as a private investigator working on the Rogers case, and explaining that she had evidence of massive federal corruption. The night editor was skeptical at first, but when Moreno mentioned specific names and dates from Rogers' documentation, his tone changed. This wasn't a crank call from someone seeking attention. This was potentially the biggest story of the decade. "I'm going to transmit photographs of documents to your fax machine," Moreno said. "If something happens to me tonight, promise me you'll investigate this story. Don't let them bury it again." She used her phone's camera to photograph the most important pages from Rogers' evidence, then transmitted them to the newspaper's fax number. It wasn't ideal, but it ensured that the documentation would survive even if she didn't. A flashlight beam suddenly swept across their hiding place, missing them by inches. The hunters were getting closer, methodically searching each potential hiding spot. It was time to move again. They split up as planned, with Santos heading toward the loading dock, while Castellanos and Sullivan created a diversion by moving toward the main entrance. Moreno took a third route, climbing a steel ladder to the warehouse's second level, where catwalks connected different sections of the building. From her elevated position, she could see dark figures moving through the warehouse below. At least 6 men, all wearing tactical gear and carrying assault weapons. They moved with the coordination of a special operations team, communicating through hand signals and covering each other's movements with professional precision. These weren't corrupt local cops or even rogue DEA agents. These were military contractors, professional killers hired to eliminate threats to the corruption network, the same type of people who'd probably killed Rogers 13 years ago. Moreno made her way across the catwalks toward a section of the building where old ventilation systems created access to the roof. If she could get outside without being detected, she might be able to escape and ensure that Roger's evidence reached the proper authorities. But as she moved through the maze of pipes and ductwork, she heard the unmistakable sound of gunfire from the warehouse floor below. Short, controlled bursts from automatic weapons, followed by the heavier boom of a .45 caliber pistol returning fire. Castellanos was in a firefight with the killers, using his experience and knowledge of close-quarters combat to even the odds against superior numbers. But Moreno knew he couldn't hold them off indefinitely. Eventually his ammunition would run out, or they would flank his position. She found an access hatch that led to the roof and pushed it open carefully. The cool night air felt like freedom after the claustrophobic atmosphere of the warehouse. But she could see more men positioned around the building's perimeter, watching for anyone trying to escape. The corruption network had committed massive resources to this operation. They were treating the elimination of Roger's evidence as a matter of national security, deploying military-level assets to ensure their success. It was both terrifying and revealing. They wouldn't go to such extremes unless the evidence truly threatened to bring down their entire operation. Moreno used her phone to call Sullivan's number, hoping he was still alive and able to answer. The call went straight to voicemail, which meant either his phone was damaged or he couldn't risk making noise. Neither possibility was encouraging. From the roof, she could see emergency vehicles approaching in the distance. Fire trucks, ambulances, and what looked like SWAT vehicles from multiple agencies. Either genuine help was finally arriving, or the corrupt agents were staging an elaborate cover story for what was happening in the warehouse. The gunfire below had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that could mean the battle was over. If Castellanos and Sullivan had been killed, she was the last person who could ensure that Roger's evidence survived. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but it also gave her clarity about what she needed to do. She made her way across the roof toward the adjacent building, where fire escapes provided access to the street level. It was a dangerous climb, but it was her only chance of escaping the perimeter that the killers had established around the warehouse. As she started down the fire escape, Moreno heard her phone ring. The caller ID showed Santos's number, and she answered quickly. "I made it out," Santos whispered. "I'm at the Chronicle building now. They're already working on the story. Whatever happens, the evidence will be published." It was the first good news Moreno had heard all night. Even if she didn't survive, Roger's 13-year-old investigation would finally see daylight. The corruption network that had killed him would be exposed, and justice would finally be served. But as she reached the bottom of the fire escape, Moreno found herself face to face with one of the killers, a tall man in tactical gear who'd been waiting for her to make exactly this move. His weapon was already trained on her chest, and his expression was coldly professional. "Ms. Moreno," he said quietly, "you've caused us considerable trouble tonight." She recognized the voice from the threatening phone call she'd received days earlier. This was the man who'd been coordinating the operation against her investigation, probably the same man who'd coordinated Roger's murder 13 years ago. "It's over," Moreno said. "The evidence is already public. Killing me won't change anything now." The man smiled without warmth. "Perhaps, but it will prevent you from providing testimony that could corroborate the documents. Dead witnesses can't appear in court." He raised his weapon, but before he could fire, the alley erupted in chaos. SWAT officers appeared from multiple directions, their own weapons trained on the killer. Commands to drop his weapon echoed off the alley walls, delivered with the authority of people who were prepared to use lethal force. The standoff lasted only seconds. Faced with overwhelming odds, the killer lowered his weapon and raised his hands. He was no longer a deadly predator. He was just another criminal being arrested by legitimate law enforcement officers. As the SWAT team secured the scene, Moreno learned that Sullivan had survived the warehouse firefight and managed to call for genuine backup. Castellanos had been wounded, but was expected to recover. Most importantly, several of the killers had been captured alive, including their leader. The corruption network's attempt to eliminate Roger's evidence had failed spectacularly. Instead of burying the truth, they'd provided additional proof of their willingness to kill anyone who threatened their operation. The military-style assault on the warehouse would be front-page news, giving credibility to the corruption allegations that Santos was preparing to publish. 3 days later, the San Francisco Chronicle ran a special edition with the headline, "Federal Corruption Network Exposed, 13-year cover-up of cop's murder revealed. The story included photographs of Rogers' hidden evidence, interviews with the surviving investigators, and detailed explanations of how DEA Administrator Robert Kellerman had orchestrated years of corruption and murder. The revelations triggered congressional investigations, federal grand jury proceedings, and a complete reorganization of multiple law enforcement agencies. Dozens of corrupt officials were arrested, including Kellerman himself, who was found dead in his Washington office of an apparent suicide just hours before federal agents arrived to arrest him. Martha Rogers read about her husband's vindication in the newspaper, 13 years after watching him drive away for what she thought was just another routine patrol. The truth about his murder was finally public, and the people responsible were facing justice. It wasn't the reunion she'd dreamed of, but it was closure. Miguel Santos, the fisherman who'd found the shell casing, became something of a local celebrity. The discovery that had started with his metal detector on a foggy morning had exposed one of the largest corruption scandals in federal law enforcement history. He gave interviews to national news programs, always emphasizing that he'd just been doing what any good citizen would do. Clara Moreno returned to her private investigation practice, but she never forgot the lesson of the Rogers case. Corruption could exist at any level of government, protected by people with resources and authority that seemed unassailable. But the truth had a way of surviving even the most determined attempts to bury it. On the 13th anniversary of Rogers' disappearance, Moreno drove out to Devil's Slide where it had all began. The highway was still dangerous, still shrouded in fog most mornings. But there was a small memorial marker now, placed by the Sheriff's Department to honor Officer James Rogers and his dedication to justice. She stood at the roadside where his patrol car had been found, looking out over the Pacific Ocean that had kept its secrets for so long. The waters were calm that morning, sparkling in the sunlight that had finally burned away the fog. Somewhere beneath those waves, the truth had waited patiently for 13 years. It had taken a fisherman's metal detector, a corroded shell casing, and the determination of people who refused to let an injustice stand to bring it back to the surface. James Rogers had died trying to expose corruption, but his death hadn't been in vain. The evidence he'd carefully assembled had finally brought down the network that killed him. His sacrifice had meaning, and his memory was honored. The fog began to roll in from the Pacific as Moreno drove away from Devil's Slide, but this time it didn't seem threatening. It was just weather, just another morning along the California coast. The devils that had haunted this place for 13 years had finally been banished by the light of truth. Officer James Rogers could finally rest in peace. His watch was over, and justice had been served.